There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as the mundane, dressed in the drab clothes of inconvenience. A missed flight, a wrong turn, a forgotten key. They present themselves as simple administrative errors, knots in the otherwise smooth thread of your day. But sometimes, these are not knots at all. They are loops, intentionally tied by a force you don't understand, pulling you off your predetermined path and anchoring you to a moment or a person that will ultimately redefine the entire map of your existence. You only recognize them in retrospect, of course. In the moment, all you feel is the sharp, irritating tug of delay, the frustration of a plan gone awry. You don't realize that the universe has just handed you a gift, wrapped in the frustrating paper of misfortune. The first night was the strangest. We were suspended in a state of shared limbo, two satellites knocked from their orbits, now circling each other in the silent, anonymous gravity of a hotel room in Lisbon. Our friends were gone, their laughter and boisterous energy already a dissipating vapor trail halfway across the Atlantic. There was only us, the hiss of the air conditioner, and the vast, unspoken territory that stretched between the two twin beds. The hotel was a last-minute booking, a place of functional despair with faded floral wallpaper and a lingering scent of lemon-scented cleaner that failed to mask decades of transient lives. Leo had handled it, his usual confident efficiency clicking into place even amidst the panic of the airport. He spoke rapid-fire Portuguese into his phone while I stood by, a silent, useless observer, my own panic a cold, smooth stone in my stomach. I was a photographer. I was meant to see things, to capture them. But in that moment, all I could capture was the image of his back, the tense line of his shoulders under his linen shirt, a bastion against the chaos that had just sideswiped our carefully planned departure. Now, in the dim lamplight of the room, that confidence had evaporated. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the scuffed parquet floor as if it held the answers to a problem set far more complex than logistical failure. The silence between us wasn't hostile, but it was heavy, dense with the ghosts of the friends who should have been there, filling the space with easy chatter. Without them, we were just two men who knew each other mostly through proxy, our friendship a series of polite nods across crowded rooms and shared smiles over group dinners. I knew the basics. Leo, the brilliant software consultant, always on a plane to somewhere new, charming, handsome, and perpetually, it seemed, just out of reach. He knew me as Sam, the quiet one with the camera, the one who observed more than he spoke. We were footnotes in each other's lives. And now, a missed alarm and a taxi stuck in inexplicable traffic had turned us into the main text. I was unpacking my bag, a useless gesture of creating order in a situation that felt anything but. I folded a shirt that was already clean, placed my camera gently on the nightstand, its lens a single, dark, unblinking eye. I was acutely aware of every small sound, the rustle of my clothes, the soft thud of my shoes on the floor, the sound of his breathing across the room. It was a slow, measured rhythm, the sound of a mind working overtime. I had spent the better part of a year cataloging details about him from a safe distance. The way his eyes crinkled when he genuinely smiled, the nervous habit he had of rubbing the back of his neck, the deep timbre of his voice when he was tired. To have him here, in this small, enclosed space, was like having a rare and beautiful celestial event happening right in my living room. It was terrifying and magnificent, and I was wholly unprepared. I had built walls around my feelings for him, careful structures of plausible deniability and friendly distance. Now, we were trapped inside those walls together, and they suddenly felt fragile as spun glass. "Sorry about this," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual bravado. It was the first thing either of us had said since the hotel room door had clicked shut behind us. I looked over at him. He hadn't moved, his shoulders still slumped, his hands clasped between his knees. The lamplight carved sharp shadows across his face, making him look younger, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. The unknowing initiator of my private turmoil looked, for all the world, like a lost kid. "It wasn't your fault, Leo," I said, and my own voice sounded foreign, too loud in the quiet room. It was a fluke. The alarm, the traffic, it was nobody's fault. He nodded, but didn't look up. Still, I should have double-checked. I'm the planner. A ghost of a self-deprecating smile touched his lips. Supposedly, I finished my futile unpacking and sat on my own bed, mirroring his posture. The space between us felt like a canyon, but also as thin as a single sheet of paper. It was a paradox I was beginning to learn was central to his presence in my life. "We'll get a flight tomorrow," I offered, trying for a tone of breezy optimism I did not feel. "It's just one more night. An epilogue to the vacation." He finally lifted his head, and his eyes met mine. In the warm, yellow light, they looked like melted honey. There was an exhaustion in them that went deeper than a missed flight. It was a soul-deep weariness I recognized because I saw it in the mirror some mornings. It was the exhaustion of always being in motion, of always performing. For all his outward confidence and social grace, I had sometimes suspected that Leo was lonely. Not in a way that he would ever admit, perhaps not even to himself, but in the small, unguarded moments I had captured from afar. A flicker of emptiness in his eyes during a loud party, a moment of stillness while everyone else was laughing. I saw it now, clear as day, with no social static to interfere. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Just one more night." He held my gaze for a long moment, and the air in the room shifted. It was no longer just empty, it was charged. It was the feeling of a storm gathering far out at sea, a change in atmospheric pressure that you feel in your bones before you can see the clouds. In that look, something unspoken was exchanged, a shared acknowledgement of our strange predicament, of our mutual isolation. It was a fleeting moment of connection so intense it made my heart ache. Then he broke the contact, looking back down at the floor, and the moment was gone. But it had happened. A door had been opened, just a crack, and I had seen something on the other side. Something that looked a little bit like me. To understand the weight of that moment, the sheer, terrifying gravity of sharing a room with Leo, you would have to understand the architecture of our friendship, if it could even be called that. We met through mutual friends, a sprawling, chaotic group of college alumni who had managed to stay tethered to one another through a series of group chats and semi-annual get-togethers. I was on the periphery of this constellation, a quiet moon to their bright, noisy suns. They had absorbed me into their orbit after my photography was featured in a gallery show one of them had attended. They were fascinated by my quiet intensity, my ability to stand at the edge of a party and see things they all missed. I was their resident artist, their observer. Leo was at the absolute center of that constellation. He wasn't just a sun, he was a supernova. He was the one who organized the trips, who remembered everyone's birthdays, who could effortlessly command a room with a single, well-told story. He worked as a high-level consultant for a tech firm, a job that sounded both impossibly complex and vaguely glamorous. It meant he was always traveling, living out of a suitcase, his posts on social media a dizzying collage of airport lounges, sleek boardrooms, and stunning cityscapes. He seemed to live a life entirely composed of highlights, a perfectly curated feed of success and adventure. He was dazzling, and from the moment I first shook his hand at a crowded barbecue 2 years prior, I was hopelessly, silently, and completely sunk. It was a foolish, schoolboy kind of crush, the kind I thought I had long outgrown. But it attached itself to me with a quiet tenacity. It wasn't about his looks, though he was undeniably handsome in a way that seemed both classic and modern, strong jaw, kind eyes, a smile that could disarm armies. It was about the glimpses of something more that I saw beneath the polished surface. I watched him the way I watched a landscape before taking a photo, waiting for the light to change, for the hidden details to reveal themselves. I noticed the way he listened, truly listened, when someone was talking to him, his focus absolute. I noticed the subtle shift in his posture when he was tired, the slight slump of his shoulders that betrayed the energetic front he presented to the world. I saw him once, across a park, playing with a friend's golden retriever, and the pure, uncomplicated joy on his face was so beautiful, it was like a physical blow. These were my private collection of moments, photographs taken only with my mind. I stored them away, a secret gallery dedicated to him. My feelings were a room I kept locked, the key tucked safely in my pocket. I was a master of self-containment, of managing my own quiet heart. I had to be. There was no indication, not a single flicker, that he saw me as anything other than Sam, the photographer friend. He was always kind, always inclusive, but his attention was a broad, sweeping beam of light, and I was just one of the many people it grazed. He had a girlfriend for a while, a sharp, ambitious lawyer named Chloe. They looked perfect together, a power couple in the making. I was genuinely happy for him, in a way that felt like chewing on ground glass. When they broke up 6 months before the Lisbon trip, the reason was vague. Something about the distance, the travel. He never seemed broken up about it, just quieter, more tired. The Lisbon trip was his idea, a way to get the whole gang together before he started a massive, months-long project in Singapore. It was meant to be a week of sun and wine and laughter, a final, collective exhale before life pulled everyone back into their separate currents. For me, it was a chance to simply be in his proximity, to soak up his presence like a plant turning towards the sun. I told myself it was for the photography, for the chance to capture the beautiful, decaying grandeur of the city. It was a lie, of course, or at least only a partial truth. I was there for him. I spent the week watching him from behind my lens, using the camera as both a shield and a magnifying glass. It allowed me to stare, to study the way the light caught the gold flecks in his eyes, the way he'd throw his head back when he laughed, a sound like tumbling rocks. He was relaxed, happy, surrounded by his people. And I was there, on the edge, documenting it all, a ghost at the feast. My camera was my alibi. It gave me a reason to be separate, to hang back, to observe. While the others jumped off a boat into the turquoise water, I was on deck, framing the shot. While they were engaged in a loud, wine-fueled debate at dinner, I was capturing the candlelight flickering in their eyes. Leo would sometimes catch my eye and smile, a small, encouraging nod, as if to say, "Get a good one." He saw my role and respected it. He didn't try to pull me into the center. He let me be in my comfortable orbit, and I was grateful for that, because it kept me safe. It kept my secret locked away. I could love him from this distance, an unrequited, academic sort of affection that was painful but manageable. It was a low, chronic ache I had learned to live with. On the last day, the day of our flight, we all woke up late, groggy from a farewell dinner that had stretched into the early hours. The morning was a frantic blur of packing, of searching for misplaced souvenirs, of shouting goodbyes across the villa. Our flight was in the late afternoon, a few hours after the main groups. It was just me and Leo on the later booking, a coincidence of airline pricing. He had offered to share a taxi with me to the airport. In the chaos of the group departure, as our friends piled into vans, shouting and laughing, Leo found me on the patio, quietly watching the sun rise over the terracotta roofs. He stood beside me for a moment, not speaking. The air was cool, smelling of salt and diesel and blooming bougainvillea. "You got some good shots, I hope," he said, his voice still thick with sleep. "I think so," I replied, not looking at him. "It's a hard city to take a bad picture of." "You see things differently," he said, a simple statement of fact. "It's like you have a filter that finds the beauty in the cracks, in the peeling paint." He paused. "I just see peeling paint." It was one of the most personal things he had ever said to me. It was a small glimpse into his own mind, an admission that he didn't see the world the way I did. It made me feel seen, in a way that was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. I just nodded, unable to form a reply. The compliment was a warm stone dropped into the cool, still pond of my morning, and the ripples were spreading. Before I could say anything, one of our friends called his name, and he was gone, pulled back into the swirling vortex of his social world. I was left alone on the patio, the warmth of his words still lingering in the air. And then, hours later, the frantic, heart-stopping realization at the check-in counter. Our flight, the one we were booked on, had been yesterday. In the flurry of booking for a dozen people, he had made a mistake. A single, critical error. Our friends were gone. Our flight was gone. We were stranded. The panic that flashed across his face was something I'd never seen before. The unflappable Leo, the planner, the one who always had it together, was utterly lost. And in that moment, my role shifted. I was no longer just the quiet observer. I put a hand on his arm, the first time I had ever voluntarily touched him, and said, "Hey, it's okay. We'll figure it out." His eyes met mine, wide and panicked, and for a second, he just held my gaze, his breath catching. My hand was still on his arm. It felt like I was holding a live wire. Then the airport official called his name, and the spell was broken. But something had been set in motion. The missed flight wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a catalyst. It was the deliberate act of a universe that had decided our parallel paths needed to violently, irrevocably intersect. The initial shock at the airport had been a cold, sharp thing, a slap of reality that left us both reeling. But as the hours wore on, that panic slowly sublimated into a strange, suspended calm. After the frantic calls and the discovery that the next available flight wasn't until the day after tomorrow, a kind of weary resignation settled over us. The city, which had felt like a shared playground for our group of friends, now felt vast and empty. The two of us were a tiny island in the midst of it. Leo, whose energy usually seemed boundless, looked utterly depleted. The mistake had hit his pride, I could tell. He saw it as a personal failure, a crack in the competent facade he presented to the world. It was this vulnerability, this sudden chink in his armor, that changed everything. It made him reachable. That first night in the sterile hotel room established the new dynamic. He was adrift, and I, for the first time, felt like I was on solid ground. My quiet nature, my tendency to observe and think before acting, became a source of stability. I didn't panic. I just saw the problem in front of us. We were stuck for 2 days and started thinking about the next logical step. It was a role reversal that was as disorienting as it was strangely fitting. The quiet moon was suddenly providing the gravitational pull for the wandering sun. After our brief, loaded exchange, we fell into a silent routine. He took a long shower, and I pretended to be absorbed in a book I wasn't reading, my senses on high alert. I could hear the spray of water, the muffled sounds of him moving behind the closed door. It was an intimacy so mundane, so domestic, that it felt shockingly profound. This was the man whose Instagram stories I watched with a kind of detached yearning, and now I could hear him brushing his teeth. When he emerged, wrapped in a too small hotel towel, his hair dark and dripping, my breath caught in my throat. He avoided my eyes, a faint blush on his cheeks as he quickly grabbed his clothes and ducked back into the bathroom to change. The air was thick with steam and the clean scent of soap. I felt like an intruder, a voyeur in a scene not meant for me. But we were sharing this space. There was no escaping these small, accidental intimacies. They were the new landscape we had to navigate. When it was my turn, I showered as quickly as I could, hyper-aware of him on the other side of the door, probably hearing the same sounds I had. When I came out, he was already in his bed, turned away from me, the sheet pulled up to his shoulders. The lamp on his side was off. "Good night, Sam," he said to the wall, his voice muffled. "Night, Leo." I turned off my own light and slid into my bed. The darkness was absolute, broken only by a thin sliver of yellow light from under the door. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of two people pretending to be asleep. I could hear the faint whisper of his sheets as he shifted, the sound of his breath, deeper now, evening out. I lay on my back, staring up at the ceiling I couldn't see, my heart beating a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. Every nerve ending felt alive, buzzing with a mixture of terror and a wild, uncontainable hope. The wall I had so carefully constructed around my feelings for him was beginning to crumble, brick by silent brick, in the shared darkness of this room. This was the shift. The ground had given way beneath our feet, and we were in freefall together. The only question was where we would land. The next day, a new ritual began to form, born of necessity and a shared, unspoken desire to create a sense of normalcy in our bizarre bubble. We were tourists against our will. We woke up to the jarring sound of my phone alarm. a sound that felt both intrusive and grounding. For a few seconds, I would lie in the unfamiliar bed, the memory of the previous day rushing back in a disorienting wave. Then I would hear him stir in the other bed, a low groan, the sound of a body reluctantly coming back to life. In the soft morning light filtering through the thin curtains, the room felt less like a cage and more like a sanctuary. It was our space, a world with a population of two. "Coffee," he'd murmur, his voice rough with sleep. "Please," I'd reply. And that was how our day started, with a shared mission. We would navigate the streets of Lisbon, which were now tinged with a strange melancholy, the ghosts of our friends' laughter echoing on every corner we turned. We found a small cafe a few blocks from the hotel, a place with chipped blue tiles and an old man behind the counter who nodded at us with solemn recognition on our second visit. We would sit at a small table outside, the strong, bitter coffee a welcome jolt to our systems. In these morning moments, conversation was sparse, but comfortable. We were like two old soldiers, veterans of a minor, absurd war against airline schedules. We'd talk about the plan for the day, or lack thereof. "We could try that museum we skipped," he suggested on the first morning, stirring his coffee with more force than necessary. "The one with all the tiles." "Sure," I said. "Or we could just walk. See what we find." My suggestion seemed to surprise him. Leo was a man of plans, of itineraries and objectives. The idea of aimless wandering was foreign to his nature. But he looked at me, a flicker of something, relief, maybe, in his eyes. The pressure to perform, to be the tour guide, was off. He was just a man stranded in a city with another man. He nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, "let's just walk." And so we walked. We walked for hours, through winding cobblestone alleys, up steep hills that left us breathless, past sun-drenched plazas and shaded courtyards. I had my camera with me, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a shield. It felt like a bridge between us. I would stop to take a picture of a peeling blue door or an old woman leaning out of a window, and he would wait patiently, watching me. He didn't pull out his phone or look restless. He just watched. Sometimes he would point something out, the way the light hit a particular fountain, a cat sleeping on a warm tile roof. He was starting to see the world through my eyes, just a little. He was noticing the beauty in the cracks. The ritual continued into the evening. We would eat dinner at small, unassuming restaurants we stumbled upon, places far from the tourist-packed thoroughfares our group had frequented. The conversation deepened in the evenings, lubricated by cheap, good wine. He started talking about his job, not the glamorous travelogue version, but the reality of it. The crushing loneliness of hotel rooms, the pressure of constant performance, the feeling of living a life that was wide but not deep. "It's like I'm always in the prologue to someone else's story," he confessed one night, swirling the red wine in his glass. "I fly in, solve a problem, and fly out. I never get to the part where people actually live." I listened, saying little, just nodding, creating a space for him to pour his thoughts into. The charming, confident Leo was peeling away, layer by layer, revealing the thoughtful, restless, and deeply human man underneath. He was sharing the parts of himself that didn't make it onto his social media feed. He was showing me his own peeling paint, his own cracks, and I found them more beautiful than any polished facade. In turn, I told him about my work, about the patience it required, the search for a single, honest moment in a world of noise. I told him about the loneliness of the observer, the feeling of being separated from life by the very lens through which I viewed it. We were two sides of the same coin, he and I. He, a man in constant motion, and I, a man in constant stillness, both of us feeling like we were on the outside looking in. But the true heart of the ritual was the night. Returning to the hotel room felt like coming home, in a strange way. The anonymous space had become ours. It was our den, our refuge. The routine was the same each night. The showers, the quiet changing, the retreat to our separate beds. But the space between those beds was shrinking. Not physically, but emotionally. The silence was no longer heavy. It was comfortable, companionable. It was filled with the unspoken understanding that had grown between us during the day. We were building a world in that room, a world made of quiet conversations and shared vulnerability. The second night, something shifted. We had spent the day getting deliberately lost, ending up at a viewpoint overlooking the entire city as the sun set. The sky was a riot of orange and pink, and the city below looked like a scattering of jewels. We didn't speak, just stood side by side, watching the day die. It was a perfect, peaceful moment. But when we got back to the room, a subtle melancholy had followed us. The beauty of the sunset had somehow highlighted our isolation. Leo was quieter than usual, his movements slow and deliberate. After his shower, he didn't immediately get into his bed. He stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. I was already in my bed, once again pretending to read. "It's funny," he said, his back to me. "I've been to dozens of cities that are more beautiful than my own apartment. I have all these pictures, these memories, but none of it feels like mine. It's like I'm collecting postcards from a life I'm not actually living." His voice was raw, stripped of all artifice. It was the sound of a deep and profound loneliness. My heart ached for him. I put my book down. "I get that," I said softly. He turned from the window and looked at me. The room was dim, only my bedside lamp was on. His face was in shadow, but I could feel his gaze on me. He hesitated for a long moment, a battle playing out in his expression. Then, he took a step towards my bed, and another. He stopped at the edge of my mattress, looking down at me, his expression uncertain, vulnerable. It was the look of a child asking for permission. "Would it be weird," he started, his voice barely a whisper, "if I sat here for a minute? My bed feels far away." My heart stopped. Then it started again, a painful, hammering beat. The air crackled. This was it. This was the moment where the unspoken became spoken, where a line was about to be crossed. The entire universe seemed to hold its breath. "No," I managed to say, my own voice tight. "It wouldn't be weird." He nodded, a small, grateful gesture, and slowly, carefully, he sat down on the edge of my bed. He didn't face me, but sat with his back against the headboard, facing the foot of the bed, so we were side by side, our shoulders almost touching. He drew his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around them. The mattress dipped with his weight. I could feel the heat from his body, a warmth that seemed to travel across the small space between us and sink into my skin. We sat in silence for a long time. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I was terrified that any movement, any sound, would break the spell, would make him retreat back to the safety of his own bed. This was the new ritual, and it was 1,000 times more potent, more terrifying, and more wonderful than anything that had come before. He was here. He had chosen to cross the empty space. He had closed the distance. We sat there, in the quiet glow of the single lamp, two lonely men on a small island of a bed, and for the first time in a very long time, neither of us felt quite so alone. The foundation for something new was being laid, not with grand gestures, but with the simple, profound weight of his presence beside me in the dark. The third night, the final night, was the culmination of everything. The ritual had been established. The previous night, after he had sat on my bed for what felt like an eternity of charged silence, he had eventually murmured a quiet thanks and retreated to his own bed. But the barrier had been broken. The space between the beds was no longer a no man's land. It was a path he had already walked. I fell asleep that night with the ghost of his warmth still on the edge of my mattress, a phantom limb I could feel all night long. Our last day was spent in a state of quiet anticipation. We knew we were leaving the next morning. Our bubble was about to burst. The knowledge lent a bittersweet edge to everything we did. We revisited the little cafe, and the old man gave us a small, sad smile, as if he knew our time was up. We walked along the river, the water glittering under the afternoon sun. The conversation was lighter, as if we were both afraid of going back to the depths we had explored the night before. We were bracing ourselves for the return to reality, a reality where we were not two men on an island, but two peripheral friends with separate lives. The thought of it was a cold dread in the pit of my stomach. I had grown accustomed to this new world we had built, I didn't want to leave it. That evening, we had dinner at a slightly nicer restaurant, a small celebration of our impending departure. We were both pretending it was a good thing. Leo was more like his old self, charming and funny, telling stories about a disastrous business trip to Tokyo. But I could see the effort it was taking him. His smiles didn't quite reach his eyes. His laughter was a little too loud. He was putting the armor back on, piece by piece, in preparation for our return. I played along, laughing at his stories, but inside, I was mourning the loss of the vulnerable, quiet man I had come to know in the dim light of our hotel room. When we got back to the room, the mood shifted instantly. The moment the door clicked shut, the performance ended. The silence that fell was heavy with all the things we weren't saying. Our time was running out. This was our last night in the sanctuary. Leo went through his nightly routine with a mechanical slowness. He took his shower, and when he came out, he was already wearing his pajamas. He didn't even glance in my direction. He went straight to his bed and climbed in, pulling the covers up. He was rebuilding the wall. My heart sank. I thought last night had been a breakthrough, but perhaps it was just an anomaly, a momentary lapse caused by exhaustion and loneliness. Perhaps now, with the prospect of home in sight, he was retreating to a safe distance. I took my own shower, my movements slow, my mind racing. I was trying to prepare myself for the disappointment. It was foolish to have hoped for more. We were a product of circumstance, a strange and beautiful accident. But accidents end. I stepped out of the bathroom, a cloud of steam and resignation following me. I expected to see him turned away from me, pretending to be asleep. But he wasn't. He was sitting up in his bed, the covers pulled around his waist. His bedside lamp was on, casting a soft, intimate glow. He was watching me, his expression unreadable. I stopped, my hand still on the bathroom doorknob. My heart, which had been sinking, began to rise, a slow, painful ascent. "Sam," he said, his voice quiet but clear. I just looked at him, waiting. He gestured to the empty space on his bed beside him. It wasn't a casual invitation. It was a deliberate, solemn offering. He was inviting me into his space, his territory. It was a reciprocal gesture for the night before, but it felt like so much more. It felt like a question. I let go of the doorknob and walked slowly across the room. The few feet of parquet floor felt like a mile-long tightrope. I sat down on the edge of his bed, just as he had sat on mine. The mattress was warm. I could smell the clean, soapy scent of his skin. I didn't look at him, just stared at my hands, which were clasped tightly in my lap. The silence stretched on, thick and humming, like the air before a lightning strike. I could feel him looking at me, his gaze a physical weight on the side of my face. "I don't want to go back," he said, his voice so low I barely heard it. I finally turned my head to look at him. His face was a landscape of conflicting emotions. There was fear there, and confusion, but underneath it all, there was a profound and desperate yearning that mirrored my own. "Back home?" I asked, my voice hoarse. He shook his head slowly. "Back to before, to how it was. Pretending. The word hung in the air between us, a shared confession. He had been pretending, too. The charming, untouchable man had been wearing a mask, just as I had. We had both been pretending. "I'm not good at this, Sam," he whispered, and his vulnerability was a gaping wound. "I don't know what I'm doing. All I know is that in the last 2 days, I've felt more real with you than I have in years. And the thought of losing that, He trailed off, unable to find the words. "I know," I said, and the simple phrase was imbued with years of silent observation, of secret affection, of my own deep loneliness. I knew exactly what he meant. He took a breath, a shuddering intake of air, as if steeling himself for a terrifying leap. He looked at my mouth, then back to my eyes. The question was there, clear and bright in the honey gold of his irises. But he was too afraid to ask it with words. His fear was a tangible thing, a cold presence in the warm space between us. And in that moment, I knew that my role as the quiet observer was over. It was my turn to act. It was my turn to be brave. I leaned in, slowly, giving him every opportunity to pull away, to stop me. But he didn't move. He just watched me, his eyes wide, his lips slightly parted. His breath hitched. I closed the final inch, the last millimeter of space that had separated us for 2 years, and gently, tentatively, pressed my lips against his. It was not a kiss of passion or of desperate hunger. It was a kiss of recognition. It was quiet and soft and breathtakingly honest. It tasted of salt and wine and a deep, shared loneliness that was finally beginning to recede. It was a question and an answer, a confession and an absolution, all in one silent, perfect moment. His lips were soft, hesitant at first, then they yielded against mine. A small, broken sound escaped his throat, and his hand, which had been resting on the mattress, came up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. He wasn't pulling me closer, just holding me, anchoring me, as if he was afraid I might disappear. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. We didn't move away. Our faces were inches apart, our foreheads almost touching. I could see the tears shimmering in his eyes, and I knew my own were probably the same. He looked at me, a look of such raw, unguarded wonder, as if he had just witnessed a miracle. "Oh," he breathed, a single, shaky syllable that held a universe of meaning. It was the sound of a man who had been lost at sea for a very long time, finally spotting land. And I, the quiet observer, the man who lived behind a lens, finally felt like I was in the picture. I was no longer on the outside looking in. I was here. We were here. Together. The crossing had been made. We had left the shore of what we were and had stepped, hand in hand, into the vast, uncharted waters of what we could become. The morning after the kiss was a delicate, fragile thing. Waking up was like surfacing from a deep and profound dream. For a moment, I was disoriented, the unfamiliar ceiling and the strange weight of the hotel sheets bringing me back to Lisbon. Then, I turned my head. Leo was still asleep in his own bed, his face turned towards me, his expression peaceful in a way I had never seen it before. The furrow of anxiety that usually lived between his brows was gone. He looked young and utterly serene. The memory of the kiss, of the hours that followed, quiet, whispered confessions in the dark, the simple, revelatory act of holding his hand until we both drifted off to sleep in our separate beds, rushed back in. A warm, overwhelming tide. It was real. It had happened. But with the morning light came the inevitable chill of reality. Our flight was in 5 hours. Our bubble, our tiny two-person world, had an expiration date. The kiss had not been an ending. It had been a beginning. But a beginning to what? What happened when we left this room, this city, this suspended reality? The fear began to creep in, a cold fog at the edges of my newfound joy. The world outside this room had rules, expectations, and established narratives. In that world, he was Leo, the globe-trotting consultant, and I was Sam, the quiet photographer. How did the men we had become in this room fit into that world? Leo stirred, his eyes fluttering open. They found mine across the space between our beds, and for a moment, I saw the same peacefulness from his sleep. A slow, gentle smile spread across his face. It was a private smile, one I had never seen before. It was just for me. My heart did a slow, painful flip in my chest. "Morning," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. Then, his smile faltered. The reality of the day seemed to land on him, the weight of it settling back onto his shoulders. The anxiety furrow reappeared between his brows. He sat up, running a hand through his messy hair. He wouldn't look at me. The beautiful, fragile connection of the night before seemed to flicker, the signal weakening with the intrusion of the day. "We should pack," he said, his voice now strained, businesslike. He swung his legs out of bed, his back to me. And just like that, the wall was back up. It was thinner this time, more transparent, but it was there. The shift was so abrupt it felt like a physical blow. I watched his back, the tense line of his shoulders, and a cold dread washed over me. Had I imagined it all? Had the intimacy of the night been a product of circumstance, a fleeting moment of connection that couldn't survive the light of day? Was he regretting it? We packed in a silence that was a painful echo of our first night in the room. But this silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the ghost of our kiss, with unspoken questions and surging anxieties. I wanted to scream, to ask him what was wrong, to force him to look at me. But I was frozen by the fear of what his answer might be. My own walls, the ones I thought had crumbled, were hastily being rebuilt, a desperate act of self-preservation. I focused on the mundane task of folding my clothes, each movement precise and controlled, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling inside me. The taxi ride to the airport was excruciating. Leo stared out the window, his jaw tight. I stared out mine. The city of Lisbon, which had become the backdrop to our transformation, now looked like a series of accusing postcards. Look what you found here. Are you going to be brave enough to keep it? I felt Leo's knee brush against mine as the taxi took a sharp turn. He flinched away as if he'd been burned. The small, involuntary movement was a confirmation of my worst fears. He was pulling away. He was erasing us. At the airport, the sterile, impersonal environment only amplified the distance between us. We checked in, went through security, and found our gate, all with the detached efficiency of two strangers who just happened to be on the same itinerary. The vibrant, living thing that had grown between us in that hotel room was withering under the harsh fluorescent lights of the departure lounge. We sat in the uncomfortable plastic chairs, a seat between us, a chasm of unspoken regret. I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was louder than any argument. I had been brave once, when I initiated the kiss. I had to be brave again. Leo, I said, my voice low but firm. He flinched, but didn't turn to look at me. He just kept staring at the flight information board, as if it held the secrets of the universe. Yeah. Are we going to talk about it? He finally turned his head, and the look on his face was one of pure, hunted panic. It was the same look he'd had when he realized our flight was gone, but 100 times more intense. Talk about what? He asked, his voice tight. The disingenuousness of the question was a sharp, painful jab. Don't do that, I said, my own voice shaking now, a mixture of hurt and anger. Don't pretend last night didn't happen. You can regret it, you can wish it hadn't happened, but you don't get to pretend it didn't exist. His face crumpled. The bravado, the avoidance, it all just fell away, leaving behind the terrified, confused man from the hotel room. He looked away again, this time looking down at his hands, which were twisting a loose thread on his jeans. I don't regret it, he whispered, so quietly I had to lean in to hear him. That's the problem. I don't regret it at all, and it scares the hell out of me. His confession was not what I expected. I had braced myself for rejection, for an apology, for an explanation that it was all a mistake. But this was something else. This was fear. Why? I asked, my voice softening. Why does it scare you? He took a long, shaky breath. Because this isn't my life, Sam. My life is airports and boardrooms and being the guy who has it all figured out. It's neat, and it's compartmentalized. And he gestured vaguely between us. This isn't neat. I don't know what it is, but it feels more important than any of that other stuff, and I have no idea what to do with it. I'm programmed to run, to move on to the next city, the next project. I don't know how to stay. His words were a torrent, a dam of carefully managed emotions finally breaking. He was afraid not because he didn't want this, but because he did. He was afraid because what he felt for me threatened to dismantle the entire structure of the life he had so carefully built. He was a man who lived by a map, and I was an uncharted territory he had stumbled into, a place so beautiful and real it made him question the validity of his entire journey. So you're just going to run? I asked, the hurt still present in my voice, but tempered now with a dawning understanding. You're just going to get on this plane, and we go back to being footnotes in each other's lives? After everything. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a desperate, heartbreaking conflict. I don't know, he said, and the honesty of those two words was more devastating than any lie. I don't know how to be the person you saw in that room. Not out here. The boarding call for our flight echoed through the terminal. It was a death knell for our bubble. People started gathering their bags, lining up at the gate. Leo stood up, his movements stiff and robotic. He looked down at me, his face a mask of misery. "I'm sorry, Sam," he whispered. And then he turned and walked towards the gate, leaving me sitting there, the space between us now an impassable ocean. I watched him go, a solitary figure disappearing into a crowd of strangers, and it felt like I was watching the best part of my life walk away from me. The conflict wasn't resolved. It had just been named. And now, he was running from it, and I was letting him go. I sat there for a long moment, frozen, as the line for the flight shuffled forward. My heart felt like a cold, heavy stone in my chest. This was it. This was how it ended. A beautiful, accidental chapter slammed shut. I thought about his words. I don't know how to stay. He wasn't rejecting me. He was rejecting himself, or at least the possibility of a different self. He was retreating into the safety of his known identity, the one that didn't have room for the messy, complicated, wonderful thing we had found. And I could let him. I could get on that plane, sit in a different row, and we could land in our home city and never speak of Lisbon again. I could go back to being the quiet observer, nursing a secret, now deeply wounded, affection. I could protect myself. It would be the safe thing to do. It would be the easy thing to do. But as I watched his back, just a few yards away from the gate agent, I thought about the man who had confessed his loneliness in the dark. I thought about the man who had looked at me with such wonder after our kiss. I thought about his hand in my hair, not pulling, just holding. He didn't know how to stay. But maybe, just maybe, I could teach him. Maybe being brave wasn't a one-time act. Maybe it was a choice you had to keep making. I stood up. I grabbed my bag. I walked not towards the gate, but towards him. I pushed gently through the line, earning a few irritated grumbles, until I was standing right behind him. He didn't notice me. He was staring straight ahead, his shoulders rigid. I reached out and gently touched his arm. He flinched and turned, his eyes widening in shock when he saw me. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights, ready to bolt. "You don't have to have it all figured out, Leo," I said, my voice quiet but steady, a small island of calm in the airport's chaos. "You just have to not get on the plane alone." I held his gaze, pouring every ounce of the hope, the fear, and the profound affection I felt for him into that look. I was offering him a choice. Not a solution, not a promise of an easy future, but a simple commitment. We would face the uncertainty together. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. The gate agent called out. Next, it was his turn. He looked from me to the agent, then back to me. The battle was raging in his eyes, the conflict between the man he was and the man he could be. I saw the fear, the doubt, the ingrained instinct to run. But then, I saw something else flicker to life. A tiny, fragile spark of courage. He took a deep breath. He let it out slowly. And then, he did something that changed everything. He reached out and took my hand. His fingers laced with mine, a firm, definite grip. It wasn't a hesitant touch. It was a decision. He turned to the gate agent, our hands still joined between us, and said, his voice shaking but clear, "We're going to need a minute." And with that, he led me away from the gate, away from the flight, away from the escape route. He didn't know how to stay, but he was choosing to learn. He was choosing me. And as we stood there, in the middle of a bustling airport terminal, holding hands like we were the only two people in the world, I knew that our accidental vacation wasn't over. It was just beginning. The resolution wasn't a grand, cinematic moment. There was no dramatic declaration of love under the fluorescent lights of the Lisbon airport. There was just the quiet, solid weight of his hand in mine. We missed the flight. Deliberately this time. It felt like a reclaiming of our own story, turning an accident into an act of will. We found a quiet corner of the terminal, and he finally, truly, talked. He talked about his fear of intimacy, a fear born from a childhood of moving around, of never putting down roots. He talked about his relationship with Chloe, how he had kept her at arm's length, using his travel as an excuse, because he was terrified of what it would mean to let someone all the way in. He talked about how the forced intimacy of our situation had bypassed all his defenses, how he had felt seen by me in a way that was both terrifying and addictive. "I've spent my whole life building walls," he said, his eyes fixed on our joined hands. And you didn't even try to knock them down. You just sat with me on the other side of them until I felt safe enough to open the door myself. I listened, and for the first time, I felt the full, staggering scope of what had happened between us. I hadn't just stumbled into a crush. I had stumbled into the hidden, locked room of his heart, and my quiet patience had been the key. We booked another flight for the next day, but this time we booked seats together. The simple act felt monumental. It was an acknowledgement, a promise. The flight home was the inverse of the taxi ride to the airport. We sat side by side, a comfortable silence between us. Every so often, his hand would find mine on the armrest, his fingers giving a gentle squeeze, a small reassurance that this was real, that he was still here. I would look at him, and he would give me that soft, private smile, the one that was just for me. The fear was still there, in the corners of his eyes, but it was overshadowed by a quiet, determined hope. Landing back in our own city was strange. The familiar landmarks looked different, colored by the new lens of our shared experience. The world we had left behind was still there, but we were re-entering it as different people. He had a car at the airport, and he drove me home. When he pulled up in front of my apartment building, the place where I had lived my solitary, observational life, a new kind of anxiety set in. This was the final test. Could the magic of our Lisbon island survive on this familiar soil? He killed the engine, and we sat in the quiet car. The streetlights cast long shadows, the city humming around us. "So," he said, his voice tentative, "this is you. This is me." I confirmed, my hand on the door handle, my heart in my throat. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at my building. Then he turned to me. "Tomorrow," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. "I'm not flying anywhere. I have 1,000 emails to answer. I should probably buy groceries. Can I do all of that boring, real-life stuff with you?" The request was so simple, so mundane, and so profoundly romantic it took my breath away. He wasn't asking for a grand adventure. He was asking for the quiet, everyday moments. He was asking to build a life, not just collect postcards. "I'd like that," I said, a real, uninhibited smile spreading across my face. He leaned across the console, and this time, the kiss was not one of tentative discovery, but of joyful confirmation. It was a promise of coffee and groceries and boring Tuesday nights. It was a promise of a new kind of normal. He came over the next day. He walked into my apartment, a space that had only ever been mine, and it felt like he had always belonged there. He sat on my worn-out sofa while I made coffee, and the quiet domesticity of it felt more intimate than anything we had experienced in Lisbon. The door to my apartment was closed, not to keep the world out, but to keep us in, together, by choice. There were no more pretexts, no more accidental intimacies. Everything now was intentional. We began the slow, careful process of weaving our lives together. It wasn't always easy. He still had his moments of panic, his instinct to flee when things felt too real. And I had my own moments of insecurity, of retreating behind my camera lens when I felt overwhelmed. But we learned to talk, to name the fears, to hold hands in the middle of the metaphorical airport terminal until the panic subsided. We learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to stay, to try, even when you were terrified. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together, a silence that wasn't empty, but full of love. Our life wasn't a vacation anymore. It was something far better. It was home.